There are stories that don't begin with a name, don't begin with a date, and certainly don't begin with a hero being introduced to the world. They begin with a feeling that every American recognizes, even without realizing it. That silent certainty that when everything falls apart, when the impossible takes over, when the world says it's over, someone will stand up. Someone will move forward, because throughout the history of the United States, from the frozen fields of World War II to the suffocating jungles of Vietnam, there have been men who refused to accept the end when it seemed inevitable. Men who didn't ask for permission to act, didn't wait for orders to do what needed to be done, and didn't retreat when anyone else would have. And this is not just another war story. It's not about strategy. It's not about politics. It's not about who won or lost a conflict. It's about something much rarer, much harder to explain. It's about the exact moment when a human being decides they will not leave others behind, no matter the cost. On the morning of a day that seemed ordinary, somewhere where the jungle was so dense that the sun barely touched the ground, a group of American soldiers was living the last minutes of their lives without even knowing it. They were trained, prepared, experienced. Men who had already faced situations that most people can't even imagine. But on that day, everything was different. The radio started to fail. Communications became confused. And then, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind of silence that comes right before the worst happens. Within minutes, the situation changed completely. What was supposed to be a quick mission turned into a nightmare with no way out. Surrounded, outnumbered, no support, no reinforcement, no real chance of making it back home. And even so, they kept fighting. On the other side, the response was brutal. Gunfire coming from every direction. Explosions that made the ground shake. A constant, crushing pressure that left no room to breathe, think, or react calmly. Every second felt like an eternity. Every decision could be the last. And as the situation rapidly deteriorated, the message being sent out of that jungle was clear, direct, and impossible to ignore. There was nothing left to be done. For those watching from afar, for those receiving that cold information through a radio, the calculation had already been made. Those men were lost. It was only a matter of time. But what makes this story different from all the others is not what happened to those soldiers. It's what happened right after. Because while most people would accept that conclusion, while every piece of logic pointed to a mission that had ended in tragedy, someone, somewhere else in that same region, heard all of it. Heard the calls for help, heard the desperation in their voices, and above all, recognized who was out there. They weren't just soldiers, they were brothers. And in that moment, with no time to think, no room for doubt, and no guarantee of coming back alive, a decision was made. A decision that doesn't appear in military manuals. A decision that makes no sense within any rational calculation. A decision that separates ordinary men from something beyond what can be explained. His name is Roy Benavidez, and what he did that day cost him 37 wounds to his own body and saved 8 lives that the world had already considered lost. Before understanding what happened on that day, before entering the jungle, before the sound of gunfire, before the decision that defied all logic, it is necessary to go much further back. Because stories like this do not begin on the battlefield. They begin in places where no one is watching. They begin in lives that, at first glance, seem to have nothing extraordinary about them. And that is exactly what makes everything even harder to believe. Because the man who would one day step into that hell was not born a hero. He was born into a world that had already decided, from the very beginning, that he would not go far. Roy Pete Benavidez came into the world on August 9, 1935, in Cuero, a small town in the interior of Texas. The son of a father of Mexican origin and a Yaqui Native American mother, he grew up in a Texas where simply existing was already a struggle. There were no promises of a future. There were no clear paths. There were separate water fountains for people with skin like his. There were sides of restaurants where he was not allowed to sit. There was a constant message, repeated in 1,000 different ways, that came without needing words. You will not get anywhere. And then, very early in life, something happened that would change everything forever. At 2 years old, Roy lost his father to tuberculosis. At 7 years old, he lost his mother to the same disease. 2 blows, 5 years apart, the same poverty as the backdrop. Childhood did not end with a specific moment. It ended with an absence, a void that cannot be explained, only felt. With no choice, Roy and his brother were sent to live with an uncle in El Campo, Texas. And there, whatever remained of any idea of childhood disappeared completely. The routine was not made of school, games, or discovery. It was made of work, fields, harsh sun, long days that began before sunrise and ended when the body could no longer respond. Roy dropped out of school in the 8th grade, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the family needed to eat, and the fields would not wait. The kind of life that leaves no room for dreams, only for survival. And as the years passed, the message the world repeated to him, silently and constantly, was simple. This is all you will be. This is all you can expect. But some people do not accept that message, not because they are special from the beginning, but because, at some point, something inside them refuses to agree. And that is exactly what happened with Roy. In the middle of a life that already seemed defined, an image appeared. A contrast so strong with everything he knew that it seemed to belong to another universe. A Green Beret soldier, part of the elite unit of the United States Army, walking through the town with a flawless uniform, the beret tilted, the eyes of someone who had seen the world. For the first time, Roy saw someone who was not trapped in that reality, someone who had chosen a different path. And in that moment, something changed inside him. It was not a detailed plan. It was not a rational decision full of guarantees. It was something more direct, a certainty that needed no explanation. He no longer wanted that life. He would not accept that destiny. In 1955, at 17 years old, Roy Benavidez went to a recruitment office and signed his name. His family doubted him. His friends laughed. Roy did not look back. And in that moment, without realizing it, he was not just joining the Army. He was beginning a journey that would put his body, his mind, and his very existence to the test in ways no training could ever predict. Because what was coming next was not just a war against an enemy. It was a war against everything they had ever said he could not be. The Army did not change who Roy was. It only revealed how far he could go. For the first time in his life, he was in an environment where the past did not define his value. It did not matter where he came from. It did not matter his last name. It did not matter the color of his skin or the kind of childhood he had. There, everything came down to a single thing: endurance. Those who endured more moved forward. Those who retreated were left behind. And it was in that setting that something began to become clear. Roy did not just keep up with the others. He endured more, trained harder, persisted longer, Where many stopped, he kept going. Where others broke, he found some way to continue. And little by little, without noise, without immediate recognition, he rose through the ranks, was selected for the Green Berets, and became part of the most demanding unit in the United States Armed Forces. When he was sent to Vietnam for the first time in 1965, he was not a rookie lost in chaos. His role was to train other soldiers to face a war that did not follow conventional rules. At first glance, it was a controlled mission. Less direct exposure, less immediate risk. But war does not respect planning, and it does not warn when it decides to completely change the course of everything. On a day that seemed to follow a normal pattern, during a routine patrol that showed no immediate danger, everything happened in a single instant. One step, just one step. And then, the explosion. The force of the blast completely destroyed both of Roy's feet, tore through his legs, and threw his body to the ground with brutal violence. He was pulled out of there urgently, transported in an emergency to the United States, and admitted to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, the country's main military hospital. Experienced doctors, accustomed to dealing with the worst possible scenarios, analyzed his condition and reached a direct and blunt conclusion. Roy Benavidez would never walk again. His career had ended right there. For anyone else, that would already be the end of the story. For Roy, it was only the beginning of another battle. When the hospital fell silent, when the hallways emptied and there was no one watching, Roy began what no one had authorized and what, by all standards, was considered impossible. He threw himself out of bed. With both feet destroyed, unable to feel his legs, he dragged himself across the cold hospital floor, inch by inch, facing constant pain and ignoring limitations that had been declared permanent. There was no audience. There was no applause. There was no recognition. Just him, and the absolute refusal to accept that diagnosis. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, until the moment came when he managed to stand. Unstable, fragile, but standing. Then came the first step, then another. The doctors had no explanation. They called it an extraordinary recovery. Roy called it refusal. When he finally returned to active duty and requested to go back to Vietnam, he was not returning just as a recovered soldier. He was returning as someone who had already faced his own end once and decided to continue anyway. And what he still did not know was that all that pain, all that struggle, all that refusal was only preparing the ground for the day he would truly be tested. What happened that day did not begin with a mistake. It began with an illusion, the illusion that it would be just another mission. On May 2nd, 1968, a team of 12 Green Berets entered the dense jungle near the border with Cambodia, in Loc Ninh province. The objective was simple on paper: observe North Vietnamese troop movement, gather intelligence, and leave without being noticed. Fast, silent, clean. Nothing out of the ordinary for men at that level, until it stopped being. The jungle, which until then had been nothing more than a silent backdrop, began to reveal something different. Movement out of place. Sounds that did not belong to the wind. And then, without warning, without time to reorganize, without any chance to retreat, reality imposed itself with total brutality. What stood before that team was not a small enemy group. It was an entire battalion of the North Vietnamese Army. More than 1,000 soldiers, positioned, prepared, and ready to strike. When the first shot was fired, there was no doubt. That was not a firefight. It was an ambush. Complete, total, with no way out. Chaos took over in seconds. Within minutes, most of the 12 men were already dead or severely wounded. The few survivors were out of ammunition, without reliable communication, using the bodies of their fallen teammates as shields. Rescue helicopters attempted to approach and were driven back by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The message that reached the base was short and brutal. There was nothing to be done. Those men were lost. Roy Benavidez was at Loch Ninh Base at that moment, off duty. He was listening to the radio when the screams began. He heard the gunfire. He heard the pain in their voices. He recognized the names. They were his men. They were his brothers. And in that instant, without asking for authorization, without waiting for orders, without making any calculation of risk, Roy grabbed a medical bag, shoved a knife into his belt, and ran toward a helicopter that was about to take off. The pilot shouted that it was madness. Roy did not respond. The helicopter lifted off. When they reached the combat zone, it became immediately clear that landing was impossible. The intensity of the enemy fire turned any approach into suicide. That was when Roy opened the helicopter door, looked down at that jungle that had already swallowed 12 soldiers, and jumped. He landed in the middle of chaos. Before even reaching his teammates, he had already been hit by shrapnel in the face. He ignored it. He began moving toward the wounded, dragging them one by one to a clearing where a possible extraction could take place. With one hand, he treated wounds, stopped bleeding, applied bandages, injected morphine. With the other, he picked up weapons from the fallen and fired back at enemies advancing through the trees. For more than an hour, Roy Benavidez was alone, both medic and soldier at the same time, in the middle of a battlefield where every second was a negotiation with death. A helicopter managed to land for a few moments, just long enough for Roy to begin loading the wounded. That was when his body started to pay the price. A bullet struck his thigh. He kept going. Another bullet hit his back. He kept going. The helicopter was hit and crashed. Roy ran to the destroyed aircraft, retrieved the classified documents the team had collected, documents that could not fall into enemy hands, and killed the North Vietnamese soldiers who were closing in to capture the survivors. At that point, Roy Benavidez had been hit so many times that it was impossible to track the injuries in real time. One of the explosions had torn his abdomen open, exposing his intestines. Without stopping, without screaming, without stepping back, Roy pushed his own intestines back into his body with his hand and kept fighting. There was no time to process it. There was no space for shock to take over. There was only the mission. No man would be left behind. That was when a North Vietnamese soldier emerged from the trees and attacked him directly with a bayonet, striking his chin and tearing through his jaw. Roy killed the man with his own knife before collapsing. On the ground, bleeding from more than 30 different wounds, with shrapnel in both eyes compromising his vision, with injuries that should have taken him out of the fight hours earlier, Roy still refused to be the first aboard when a second helicopter finally managed to land. Somehow, he got back on his feet and made sure that every wounded man, every body, every teammate was loaded onto the aircraft before him. Only then, the last of all, Roy boarded. The mission had lasted 6 hours. 37 recorded wounds later, 8 men alive who would not be without him. When the helicopter landed, Roy Benavidez was motionless, covered in blood from his scalp to his boots, unresponsive, with no clear signs of consciousness. The medic who approached did what any trained professional would do in that situation. He assessed, found no reliable vital signs, and made the most logical decision available. Roy Benavidez was declared dead in the field. They began to place him inside a body bag. The zipper was being pulled up when Roy did the last thing anyone would expect from a man in that condition. He spat blood in the medic's face. The medic stepped back, stood still for a moment, with Roy's blood running down his own face, processing what had just happened. Then he shouted for help. Roy was alive. Roy was pulled out of the body bag and rushed into emergency surgery. In the months that followed, he underwent more than a dozen surgical procedures. Doctors cataloged the 37 wounds with the cold precision that medicine demands: bullets, shrapnel, burns, bayonet lacerations, internal damage caused by explosions. Each wound, on its own, would have justified immediate evacuation. Roy had accumulated all of them in 6 hours and remained standing. When he finally regained enough clarity to understand where he was, the first thing he asked about was the men he had rescued. When they told him they were alive, Roy closed his eyes and remained silent for a long time. No one asked what he was feeling. Some moments do not need words. What Roy Benavidez had done was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary acts ever performed by an American soldier in decades. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, awarded by the President himself and reserved for acts of valor that exceed any reasonable expectation of duty, was the natural and obvious consequence. But the military is, above all, a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy demands documentation. The mission had taken place in a classified area, near a border that the United States did not officially acknowledge operating in. The records were fragmented, the testimonies were scattered, and so, while Roy was recovering from 37 wounds, the paperwork that would recognize his sacrifice was filed away, lost, denied. For 13 years, Roy Benavidez lived with the knowledge that no one, outside the men he had saved, fully knew what he had done. But one of the soldiers rescued that day, a man named Roger Locker, did not forget. And he did not allow the world to forget either. Locker spent years gathering testimonies, tracking down survivors, reconstructing the timeline of those 6 hours with the obsession of someone who knows he owes another human being in a way that no words can fully express. The case reached Congress, and then it reached the desk of President Ronald Reagan. Reagan read the full account. According to those present, when the president finished reading, there were tears in his eyes. The ceremony took place on February 24th, 1981, at the White House. Roy Benavidez stood in uniform with the posture of a soldier and the eyes of someone who had carried a heavy story for 13 years. Reagan placed the Medal of Honor around Roy's neck and then turned to the military personnel present and said a line that would be remembered in history. "Gentlemen, this is the greatest American soldier who ever lived." In the audience, the men Roy had saved on that day in May 1968 were standing. Some were openly crying. 13 years later, the debt had been acknowledged. Not repaid, because that kind of debt is never repaid, but acknowledged. Roy Benavidez could have chosen anything after 1981. With the Medal of Honor on his chest and the personal endorsement of the President of the United States, the doors that had always been closed to him because of his origin, because of his last name, because of his poverty, were now wide open. Expensive speaking engagements, military consulting, television appearances, books turned into bestsellers. Roy Benavidez chose to return to El Campo, Texas, and he chose to speak to children. Specifically, he chose to speak to children who looked like the boy he once was. Poor children of immigrants. growing up in a world that sent them the message in 1,000 different ways that they had no value. Roy visited public schools for years, sat in modest auditoriums with plastic chairs, and spoke directly to eyes that still did not know what they wanted to become. And Roy's message was never about war, never about medals or heroism or glory. It was always about the same thing. You do not need money. You do not need a wealthy family. You do not need the world to believe in you before you believe in yourself. You only need to refuse to stop. He wrote a book, The 3 Wars of Roy Benavidez, about his 3 battles: the war of poverty in his childhood, the literal war in Vietnam, and the bureaucratic war during the 13 years he fought to have his sacrifice recognized. But the 37 wounds from 1968 never fully disappeared. Roy developed severe diabetes over the years, a condition aggravated by the physical trauma his body had endured decades earlier. He fought the disease with the same stubborn determination he had used to fight everything else. On November 29, 1998, Roy Pete Benavidez died in San Antonio, Texas, at 63 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston. The men he had saved in 1968 were there. None of them needed to be called. There is a question that always arises when telling the story of Roy Benavidez. A simple question, almost naive, but one that no one can fully answer. Why? Why would a man who had already nearly died after stepping on a mine, who had already been sent home in a wheelchair, who had already fought to regain the right to simply walk, why would that man, on a day when he was off duty, without orders, without a firearm, carrying only a knife and a medical bag, decide to jump out of a moving helicopter into a battalion of 1,000 enemy soldiers? The most honest answer is also the simplest, because they were his brothers, not by blood, but in the only form of brotherhood Roy Benavidez had known since he found his place in the world, the brotherhood of people who chose, together, to serve something greater than themselves. And in that moment, facing that impossible choice, 30 years of poverty, loss, pain, rejection, and an absolute refusal to accept limits condensed into a single action. He went. Roy Benavidez was born in a Texas that did not want him. He grew up an orphan, poor, picking cotton while the world looked the other way. The army nearly retired him in a wheelchair. A Vietnamese jungle nearly killed him 37 times in a single day, and the very government he served took 13 years to formally recognize what he had done. In none of those moments did Roy complain. In none of those moments did he wait for the world to be fair to him before giving his best. That is the most silent and most powerful lesson of Roy's life. Not the courage of a single day, but the courage of an entire life spent refusing to accept the limits others decided for him. Today, there are streets named after Roy Benavidez. There is a United States Navy ship that bears his name. There are memorials, plaques, historical records. But Roy's most real legacy is not in bronze or steel or marble. It is in the 8 men who made it home on that day in May of 1968. It is in the children those men had, in their grandchildren, in everything that existed afterward, because one man with a knife and a medical bag decided he would not leave his brothers behind. A man the army itself declared dead, and who spat blood in a medic's face to prove that he was not. His name is Roy Pete Benavidez, son of a Texas that did not believe in him, soldier of a country that took 13 years to recognize him, and the bravest man who ever wore an American uniform. And the world almost never knew.